Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Preemie Chats. Preemie Chats is our weekly educational sessions for healthcare professionals and parents to talk about what matters to you, to explore new ideas, and to learn together. I'm Fabiana Bacchini. I'm a Preemie parent and executive director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, as known as CPBF, and I'm happy to be your host today. CPBF is a parent-led organization that helps families in and after the NICU through support, education, and advocacy. If you have a heart for preemies, whether you're a family or a healthcare professional, please check our website at canadianpreemies.org. There you'll find resources, the latest projects, and most importantly, a community of people who want to see our little babies thrive. And if you're watching live, please bring your voice to this table. Leave comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to address them during our program. It is through rich conversations like this that we can advance practice and learn together. So please participate and let us know where you're watching from. And today's topic is about reading difficulties and preterm children. We'll talk about the challenges that preterm children might face when it comes to reading. Our guests will cover how parents can detect early signs of reading challenges and evidence-based at-home activities you can do to enhance your child's reading skills. And we have three amazing guests joining us live today from many parts of Ontario. And I have here, I'm going to introduce one by one. First, Dr. Jan Frijters. Oh, I knew I was going to get your last name wrong. He's the co-founder and chief child psychologist at Sharpen. He's also professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University and associate editor of the Journal of Learning Disabilities. He's internationally recognized for his research on providing and evaluating reading interventions, examining the genetic and brain basis for reading difficulties, and examining how neuropsychological characteristics interact with these factors. Jan, thanks so much for joining us here today. Next, we have Prarthana Franklin-Luther, who is the senior research scientist at Sharpen. She worked in the psychoeducational setting as a psychometrist for several years. Her graduate research at Brock University focused on parenting and early child development. Her postdoctoral research at McMaster University focused on mental health support for families with preterm infants. And that's when we met a few years ago, and it was a great collaboration. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Band, who is currently a consultant at Sharpen and is one of the chief architects of the Sharpen Reading Program. In his 40-year career, he has worked extensively with students who have had learning challenges, especially in the area of reading. He has served on the board of the Pennsylvania-Delaware branch of the International Dyslexia Association and of the Family Reading Partnership in Ithaca, New York, and has been a member of the Delaware Task Force on Reading. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us live here today. I am very excited about this talk and what are the tools that we can provide our families and our children. So I let you take on from here. And for all of you watching us live, please do send your comments or questions. You address them at the end of the presentation. Prar, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. We're all excited to be here and contribute to this discussion today. Over the last few years, I've become an avid plant enthusiast, so I would like to start with a plant analogy for our presentation. So imagine that you planted a seed or a plant in a garden. The environment in the garden could be really uncertain. Some days you could have clouds in the sky that limit sunlight. Sometimes there may not be enough water, or the soil may not be optimal. And this is what we call, in human terms, developmental risk. Sometimes in the child's development, either perinatal, in utero, or postnatal, there could be various factors in the environment that may be out of our control that can lead to various developmental outcomes. And this can influence the child's cognitive, health, social, emotional, language, and literacy outcomes. But the amazing part is that plants are adaptable. They can adapt to any environment. So if they find sunlight, they can lean towards the sun. They can stretch their roots into the soil to find more water. And if you put them in a different environment, they can begin to thrive. And the same thing happens in humans. When children, even though they start from a different environment and they may face obstacles, if given the right environment and supports, they can thrive and learn and do much better. And this is what we call developmental plasticity. So, in face of obstacles or adverse situations, developmental plasticity ensures that children can have a range of developmental outcomes despite any type of developmental risk. And preterm birth is one type of developmental risk that some children may face early in development, which can lead to various types of neurodevelopmental disorders and challenges. But as we mentioned, it doesn't always have to be this way. Here are some examples of some developmental outcomes commonly found in extremely or very preterm children. And some of these outcomes, there are things we can do to explicitly reduce the effects or even prevent these effects. Some of these outcomes, there's less direct strategies, but there are also other types of accommodations and supports we can provide in order to increase quality of life. For example, there's various accommodations children can get with visual impairments, behavior problems. There's various strategies we can do to ameliorate those concerns. Preterm children normally have neurodevelopmental abnormalities, but again, they can have assistive technologies to help increase the quality of life. We see lots of educational challenges like grade failure in high school and adolescence. But again, there's lots of research showing that we can have strategies in place to help reduce these effects. And finally, the main topic we're here to discuss is about reading challenges. Up to 44% of preterm children are shown to have a serious impairment in reading. But over the last 30 years, there's been a tremendous amount of research showing that we can reduce and prevent these effects with the right type of strategies. And Dr. Jan Frijters will talk more about this now.
Thank you, Prar. That was a great setup to actually talking about reading and its place in child development. If you have a child or you've been close to a child between about 2 and 4 years of age, you've experienced the absolute explosion of vocabulary and the number of words a child knows. And it doesn't increase evenly and slowly. It starts, and when it takes off, it really, really takes off. Reading is very much like this. It happens a little later, but what reading does is it opens up to a child a world of concepts, a world of facts and knowledge, and it opens up a world of instruction. And this is how reading itself links back to some of those things Prar was talking about, which is the risk that a child will either fail at school or disengage from school or not learn in school. So here's how it goes. First point on this slide, a child who reads 5 minutes a day. It seems hard to imagine, but if you take a child reading about 100 words a minute, who reads 5 words a day every day for a whole year, they will encounter 200,000 words. Now, 5 minutes a day is actually not a lot. An avid reader, something you would call like a bookworm, who would read an hour a day. An avid reader tends to be a more proficient reader, reading about 180 words a day. If every day that child reads an hour, that's 4 million words a year that child encounters. And what that means is there are 4 million words to encounter new concepts, to engage in imagination, to witness social interaction in literature, to read poetry, to encounter content of all varieties. After that context, it's not a surprise that kids who read more do better in school. So why does this matter? Well, there are a group of children, and obviously this is not just about preemies, but this is about a group of children, about 15% of all children who, yeah, you can go on to the next slide. About 15% of all children who really struggle with reading. Part of the problem is the English language. Unlike Italian, and I know Fabiana would have something to say about this, unlike Italian, there is not an equal correspondence between the letters we have and the sounds they make, and that causes significant difficulties. Well, what happens when these difficulties emerge? I've been working for about 25 years in child clinical and educational psychology, and a lot of my research centers around those children experiencing the most difficulties. When I see those kids, what I see is problems with self-esteem. And when a child can't read or picks up a book and experience barriers such as words they can't read or sentences they can't get through to the end, then a child disengages from learning in school. And all these negative effects, as you can imagine, cascade. We can go to the next. The positive is that when we've done research on what kind of things we can do to ameliorate, to get to the top of that developmental envelope that Prar was talking about, when we do intervene for kids who are having struggles, the earlier we intervene, the better. We learned very, very early on at Sick Kids that when you intervene at grade 3, it's virtually impossible to bring kids up to developmental levels of reading ability. When you intervene at grade 2, you can do it for about 50% of kids. But when you intervene at grade 1, you can reach 75% of kids who start with the most severe risk for future reading problems. And here's a chart that just shows that. You can see that virtually every child in grade 1 attains grade level reading, and not only attains grade level reading, but until grade 3, which is as long as we track them, maintains at or above grade level. You can go to the next slide. So one other thing that I've done some research into is the role of parents. And there is a tendency as parents to think, well, we have school and school takes care of reading. But reading really is the most wonderful cultural invention that has come out of humanity. 5,000 years ago, we started reading, and humans are mimickers. We are people who watch other people and copy their behaviors and their attitudes. And the huge role that parents have at showing children what it means to read, what it means to show interest in reading, what books are all about, is enormous. Children who have parents who are engaged and interested show increased interest. Children who have parents who are engaged and interested and fill a child's life with literacy have better performing literacy scores later on. I'll go to the next slide. So that's the positive and the negative. You know, the risks of a child not reading, but also the huge positives for when a child does read. The other thing that parents tend to give over to the schools is to say, well, the child is there to monitor my child's risk or to monitor whether my child is falling behind. The reality in our schools today is that we have issues with large class sizes. Schools are designed to cater to the average child. And the hardworking, very attentive classroom teacher cannot always notice the needs of every child. But with the right tools, and this has been the core of my work for the last 15 years, parents who are the best observers of their child behavior, who know their individual child the best, parents with the right tools can pick up a risk of early reading problems sooner than anyone. And how can a parent do this? They need a tool to look at the different language skills emerging in their child and to know whether they're emerging at the right time. Should this be the time when I expect my child to be able to repeat a sentence back to me? Should this be the time that my child should understand common words and be able to use them to do something? Parents also are the prime observers of early literacy skills. Whether a child can manipulate the sounds in language, which Dr. Ben will talk about is phonological awareness, whether a child recognizes and gains knowledge of letter sounds. And parents with the right tools can actually assess their child's early literacy skills to know whether their child is picking up those skills at the right time to be on track for that absolutely critical grade 1 year. The other thing that parents know is the child's family history. Reading is genetic. About 40 to 80% of reading skill is determined by your genes. And a parent knows that child's family history. Was there an uncle in the family who had trouble picking up reading? Was there a grandfather who dropped out early from school? Go to the next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ben. Hopefully I've set things up well for you.
Oh, you're muting.
Yes, got it. You're right. Now, I think that's a beautiful setup. Thank you, Dr. Frijters. All right. If you look at a proficient reader, one of the most obvious and important characteristics of their proficiency is that they're able to read a lot of words automatically with no conscious effort. And under most circumstances, when reading, the experience of a proficient reader is that words just pop into their heads without any awareness of the mechanism involved in translating speech to print. So a central goal of beginning reading instructors is to help children acquire the skills necessary for this automatic word recognition. And as a result of decades of research that Prar alluded to at the beginning of the talk, we know that developing automatic word recognition requires the development of a number of critical subskills. Now, while many children can acquire these subskills pretty much regardless of the kind of instruction that they receive, there are some students whom we can identify now with the indicators that Jan just talked about pretty reliably. Some students require explicit instruction that focuses very explicitly and focuses very carefully on the development of these subskills. And we have at our disposal developmentally appropriate and engaging activities that do just that, and that have been shown to change the brains of at-risk readers so that they are able to process text in the efficient ways that allow for the development of this proficient automatic word recognition. So next slide, please. So what are the characteristics of reading instruction that does all that? There are just a few of them that are really, really critical. One is that this child gets extensive practice in sounding out words, which technically we refer to as phonic decoding. For example, if a student looks at the letter C-A-T and doesn't know what that word is, they can sound it out by going k-a-t, cat. They can articulate the individual sounds and then blend those sounds to form a whole word. Just in doing that activity, you can see that phonic decoding itself is a composite activity based on two subskills, namely understanding letter-sound relationships. The child has to know that the letter C represents the sound k and the letter A represents the sound a, for instance. And then the ability to take individual sounds like k, a, t, and understand that they are constituents of the whole word cat and can be blended to form the whole word cat. So this is an absolutely critical and essential subskill that needs to be built up, and we know how to do that. One other point I want to make is that while it's an essential and critical subskill, it's only one step on the path to developing automatic word recognition. Sometimes the prophonics side gets pilloried as just wanting students to be able to sound out words. Yes, this is absolutely critical and an important part of beginning instruction, but it's only one part in the step toward that automatic word recognition. Now, our writing system is based on sound units that are smaller than whole words. And to use our example of cat again, we spell the word the way we do because the word cat, the oral sound cat, the syllable cat, is made up of three individual sounds, k, a, and t. And then we can represent each of those sounds with a particular letter. These individual speech sounds like at are referred to as phonemes. So for a child to understand the general organizing principle for our writing system, they have to be able to understand how words can be broken into these individual sounds. In addition, there's very good reason to believe that that mental database that we have that allows for automatic word recognition is organized by sound, which means that the deeper and richer and better developed a person's ability to negotiate and understand the sound structure of words, the better and more efficient their automatic word recognition will be. So phonemic awareness needs to be developed at a high level. This third point about orientation of instruction from speech to print is probably more of a desiderata, something desirable rather than an absolutely essential feature. And I encourage you to look up speech to print reading programs or reading instruction on the internet, because there's a lot of new interesting work about that. I think what this will do is make when we orient instruction in this way, we make the instruction much more efficient. So what does that mean? So traditionally, phonics instruction has been print to speech. And a very common way for teachers to begin instruction would be to hold up a card with the letter M and say, boys and girls, this is the letter M. Its sound is That's the first sound in mouse, motorcycle, and monkey. Now, there's nothing per se wrong with that, but if you think about it, it's starting a little bit backwards. It's starting with the code rather than what needs to be encoded. Another problem with the print-to-speech orientation is that if you think about it, a child comes to school as a kindergartner with thousands and thousands of hours of experience with oral language. But even students with strong preparation come with much less experience with literacy, with exposure to letters and words. And so when we start with the letters themselves, we start with the system that's the weakest developed. It turns out to be much easier to help students make fast progress when we initially activate the language system that's strongest in them, their oral language system, and then show them how the new information we want, the letters of the words and how to read words, is connected to that oral language system. And it also allows us for a way, won't have time to discuss that much today, but it also allows us for a way to take even a messy orthography, a messy writing system like English, and make the relationship to the letters and sounds as transparent as possible. It's never going to be as transparent as Italian, but we can make it much clearer if we orient instruction from speech to print. And finally, this is a non-contentious but extremely, extremely important point. The thing that catalyzes all this skill of being able to sound out words and to understand the sound structure of words at a high level is reading connected text, just reading out loud and silently. There's no substitute for that. And as the slide that Jan began his presentation indicates, you can see the benefits of lots of reading. The brain is an information processor, and it's better developed with the more information that it processes. So a really critical element to have strong reading growth is that the child has ample opportunity to read connected text. And I think this is a point, as I said, though it's not contentious, is a point that's often underemphasized in the pro-phonics camp. We absolutely want kids to read lots of text, and we want them to read lots of engaging and interesting text to do all the language development that Jan referred to. Next slide. So what does that look like in practice? So when I work with beginning students, I do exercises like the one I'll just demonstrate to you here. We're going to spell the word mop, and letter tiles to spell that word have been presented in the workspace. What's the first sound in the word mop? And if the child knows that it's that's great. If they don't, I say, oh, the first sound in the word mop is and then I show them what letter is used for it and move it to the first space. What's the next sound in the word mop? It's ah, and here's how we write ah. What's the last sound in the word mop? It's p. Let's show how to do the p. And then after the word is correctly formed, then I say, I'm going to do something called tap and say, watch me do it. And then I tap each letter in turn and say its sound individually like this, ah, and then I run my finger under the whole word and say mop. So you can see in an activity like this, we have basically all the food groups, right, for good reading instruction. We're segmenting a word into the individual sounds. We're explaining why words are spelled the way they are. We're making explicit connections between sounds and letters. And then we're reconstituting the whole word after we've taken it apart. We're putting Humpty Dumpty back together again by saying the individual sounds and then saying what the whole word is. Next sound, please. Slide, please. Right. And then next sound, you see, I'm a reading teacher. I'm always dealing with the next sound. And then a very good thing to do is to focus on just a small number of words, but analyze the heck out of them. That is to say, really help the student reinforce the idea of how the letters represent the sounds. So we might show the student this word and say, hey, this is the word we just spelled a few minutes ago. This is the word mop. Let's say and write it. So they write it, but every time they're writing, they have to articulate the individual sound. And because notice we're going from speech to print, which is basically oriented like a spelling activity. They already know what the word is. We said we're going to spell the word mop, or we're going to write the word mop, and then they can connect those individual sounds with the whole word. And I think we're ready for the next slide. And we have just a little video to show you that actually real kids change one sound in cap to make cop. Cop is a name for a police officer. Cop. You are getting so good at this. Cop, cop. Change one sound in cop to make top. Top. Please put the top on the marker. Top. Awesome job. Right. So there was a work with a kindergarten student in a remote environment. The student was manipulating the letter tiles on his screen. That was a little bit a higher level activity than the word puzzle, because now the student is making a comparison of one word with the other, a word that's different by only a single sound, which is a very, very powerful way to build up that phonemic awareness, to build up the student's ability to understand that sound structure of words. So what can you do at home? Here are some things. For the top two items, I would think 3 words in particular. You want to read, sing, and talk. You can just, it's all, you just want to bathe the child in language. The more language experience they have, the stronger the language system is that we can hook on information about letters and reading. When you're picking reading activities, try to include some that direct the attention of the sound structure of words to the child. Now, it just so happens that since time immemorial, human beings have embedded wordplay into songs and poems and stories for children. Think fee, fi, fo, fum, hey, diddle, diddle, the cat and the fiddle, hickory, dickory, dock, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Okay, and when I was making my notes for this talk, I realized that my son, who's now 30 years old, when he was 3 and 4, listened to the Canadian singer Raffi, who has an enormous number of songs that really bring attention to the sound structure of words and do wonderful, wonderful wordplay like Willoughby Wallaby Woo, Down by the Bay, and Apples and Bananas. So find some time. This doesn't have to be the exclusive focus of the reading, of course, but find some time to find songs, poems, and stories where there's an emphasis on the first sound of the word or the rhymes of the word. There's tons of material out there that does that for the preschool set. And then the last items on this list are really just helping the child set a context for reading, understand reading, and to make reading a part of his or her daily life. These are fairly common sense kinds of things, but they're extremely, extremely important in terms of what you can do at home. Next slide. I think it's for you to wrap up, Prar.
Yep. So finally, we just wanted to mention some key takeaway points from our presentation. We know that reading problems can be more common in preterm children, but as we mentioned in the presentation, there's lots of ways like early screening, early intervention that can really help children get up to grade level reading. And with the right tools and knowledge, parents can identify these risks and look for the right types of interventions to really help their child's learning journey. And if you want more information about early screening tools or evidence-based research, evidence-based reading programs, you can visit sharpen.com. You can also email us at support@sharpen.com if you have any questions. We have a special promotion for members of CPBF to get tools like early screening and evidence-based reading programs. So please feel free to email us. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, let me remove this. Wow, that was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for shining a light for us parents on this very common issue, especially with our preemie babies. So my first question is, knowing that our preterm babies are at risk of having reading difficulties later on in life, how early can we start? Because as preemie parents, we are encouraged to sing to the babies in the ICU, to read books, to talk to the babies, and then we will continue to help those babies at home, especially the first year, to develop language. But the reading process, how early can we start knowing that they are at higher risk?
Jan, do you want to take that one?
I was going to defer to Dr. Ben.
Well, how about you all give us an answer?
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I'll start for sure. You know, the very first thing that we can do with reading, I think, Fabiana, you were right on, and that is work with language. And what Dr. Ben pointed attention to was to do things that draw a child's attention to the sounds in language. That is the single earliest thing that we can do for a skill that directly relates to reading later on. And then the second thing that we can do is to draw kids' attention to letters themselves and how letters are related to the sounds. But here is where I do need to defer to Dr. Ben, because he'll have some very specific ideas about this.
I hope they're good. I hope they're good ones. So I would be very cautious about doing too much that seems school-like with children below the age of 5. Once children are ready for kindergarten, then it's fine to have 10, 15, 20-minute activities that look like school, like that kind of activity that I demonstrated. Before then, for kind of formal academic lessons, I would really go with the interests and the motivation of the child. Some children at 3 and 4 are very interested in letters and want you to sit down and say, I'm going to learn how to write my name. I'm going to learn how to write the name of my brother and sister and that sort of thing. If the child is motivated with that, motivated to do that, and is interested in doing that, yes, you can sit down with a 3 and 4-year-old and start doing that. But I would do it for 3 and 4-year-olds only at following their own interest. But there are things that you can do similar. So you can certainly do some proto-writing activities. Most 3 and 4-year-olds are starting to become interested in learning how to write their names. So that's a very nice place to start. Children at 3 and 4, especially all children, but especially preschool age children, learn through play. So that's why the recommendations for setting up opportunities to write and so forth. And a 3-year-old can start writing to grandma and grandpa, and it can just be some scribbles on the paper. That's perfectly appropriate. That's sort of proto-writing, but they're getting the idea of that. And then as their awareness becomes greater, then they can start maybe making the first letter of their name or the first letter of grandma or grandpa's name. And their writing can then start to approximate so-called, formal official writing. But I think really it's bathing the child in oral language, doing the kinds of language activities that call their attention to the sound structure of words, and some minimal work with dealing with letters and letter sounds. And I would encourage that work that you do with letters to be focused on words rather than just going through the alphabet, in order. I mean, it's fine to have an alphabet chart on the child's wall, and it's fine to have alphabet blocks, but in terms of writing, it should be done in terms of meaningful words on a grocery list, words of members of a family, and that sort of thing.
So one question that I have, because when I had my first son, who was not the preterm baby, the term baby, somebody gave me early reading program as a DVD set to reading. Is a reading program for babies.
Right.
And I
I've
looked
seen
at
that
myself.
before, right?
I said, I don't know if I should do all these DVDs with this early reading for a child. But a lot of parents, they ask us, like, is this something that can help the babies or something we should avoid altogether?
Yeah, I really don't think that there's any evidence that gets a kid farther along. If you get a child off to a good start in kindergarten and first grade, you won't be able to tell, when they're 18 years old and ready to graduate from high school, they will be, if they've gotten the right kind of instruction, you won't be able to distinguish them from somebody who started at 3 or 4. I don't think so. I don't think you'd be able to see that distinction.
So we have a question from Sabrina. Sabrina, thank you for joining us here today. She said, thank you for this great presentation. I wonder how to integrate the learning of another language at the same time. Here we speak both French and English, and we wonder if we should focus on one only. And she added another question, what is the evidence for bilingual children? Thank you, Sabrina.
Well, that's a great question. And that's above my pay grade, or I don't have a special background in multilingual acquisition. I do know some things, and Jan and Prar can correct me because they might be much more familiar with the research. I do know that when there is more than one language spoken at the home, certain language milestones are delayed because the child needs time to start organizing that. So maybe the total number of words spoken at the age of 2 or 3 is a little bit less, and maybe the mastery of certain basic grammatical structures is delayed. But by the time the child is 5 or 6, they're in an advantaged position because they have a much richer understanding of language because they have multiple examples. We can make vocabulary, and we can organize words and sentences in a variety of ways, thousands and thousands of ways that human beings do that with different languages. And if you speak 2 or more languages as a child, you have more access to that variety, and you end up having a richer understanding of language. So that's my understanding of that. Probably best to focus reading instruction on one language, but I think oral language to get them started, because it is pretty demanding to learn how to read. But I couldn't cite research on that for you, sorry.
So this is a huge topic, and thank you, Sabrina, for your question. The absolute good news for you, Sabrina, is all of the wonderful research that is being done with bilingual individuals showing that even recovery from stroke, which happens at 80 years old, is better for bilingual individuals. The vocabulary size of bilingual individuals is bigger than the vocabulary of each language combined. So the advantages to your child's cognition, even future mental health, is so huge. That's on the one end of the lifespan. On the other end of the lifespan, Dr. Ben mentioned that you can have little delays when a child is just emerging in learning 2 languages. You can have these little delays, and probably the most important message to parents is not to stress out that their child in either English, or is it French in this case? Yes. In either English or French is just a little bit behind. When that child sorts that out, and the vast majority of kids do, they actually have such an advantage for being bilingual. So that's kind of the 2 ends of the developmental spectrum of a bilingual person's life. But our chat here is a little bit about assessing risk. And what if you suspect that your child is a little more than a little behind. What do you do, especially if they're in a bilingual context? The most important thing to do, this is just me as a child psychologist speaking, if you assess risk, like if you really want to monitor and you have this, you know, that feeling that a parent has, that gut feeling that no, something is wrong beyond just a little bit, it's so important to assess for risk in the language that the child has had the most exposure to. And that's the oral language, not the written language, but the oral language. Because what I've seen over and over again as a researcher, because we do research in school systems, and when you identify kids as at risk or not at risk, so that you can give them an intervention, often what will happen is when a child is not fluent in the language of instruction, that can mask a reading difficulty, or it can simply be that they haven't learned the language of instruction. So imagine, I'm speaking as the child of immigrant parents. Imagine a child of an immigrant parents who comes to Canada, in my case, knowing only Dutch, and I'm failing to pick up English reading. Is that because I'm at risk or because I haven't become fluent in English yet? So you have to assess in the language that is most considered the home language, the language of exposure, the language of development, if you're interested in assessing for risk.
Wow, that is so great. And obviously this hits home because I am an immigrant. My husband is a son of an immigrant. And our house will have 3 languages ongoing. So my my preemie was certainly delayed with his language, which did an early assessment. And I'm glad we did, because he could read really well, but not have the comprehension of what he was reading. So and I think I want to get to that point as well, because the early screening. Yes, we do have the gut feeling something is not quite right as a parent, but also as preemie parents are always on the alert for everything around us, right? Because of our experience, and we know the risks. When do we request an early assessment? If something that we suspect at home before the school actually comes to you and say, yeah, maybe you should have an assessment done on your child, which in Ontario is being taking quite a long time for those assessments to be done in the school setting.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. What everyone in the audience might not be aware of is that actually recently, somewhat recently, there was a ruling by the Ontario Human Rights Commission that the Ontario system is actually discriminating against children at risk for reading failure, because as a system, we do not screen for early risk for reading problems. And one of the big recommendations of the Ontario Human Rights Commission was that schools should implement kindergarten screening, but we haven't done it yet. You know, I have colleagues who work with schools, and when the commission came out, schools started to scramble. We don't even know what tools to use. We don't even know how to do this in a way that we could screen every child. So it will be some time before our system adapts and starts to really pay attention to this. You know, in my part of the talk, I mentioned that the parents have such a rich knowledge of their child. But what parents don't know is what to look for. And that's where the tools can come into play. Now, I am a member of Sharpen, and of course, we have our tools. We think they're amazing tools. There are similar tools out there that you can find. Some are for free. I can't guarantee the quality of all the tools that are out there. But what they really boil down to is tapping into your knowledge as a parent, the behaviors that you've seen your child do or not do at 6 months, at 12 months, at those important milestones where, Fabiana, you said, you know, you're alert for difficulties. Well, when you hit those milestones of age, that's when you start to say, oh, my child's 9 months. Can they? So what a good tool will do is give you a list of 20 things that you should have seen in your child by 9 months or by 12 months. These would be language things. or just before kindergarten. These would be early literacy behaviors that you as a parent have seen in your child, but you don't know, is it the right time? Is my child behind? And that's where a good tool takes care of all of that for you. So just before kindergarten, through kindergarten, there are some wonderful tools to see, as my child developing those first signs of early literacy.
We have a question here from Josephine. Do you go do assessment by the chronological age or corrected age? I can put on that we always go for the corrected age until the age of 2 or 3. Is it the same case for this reading assessment?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And as you know, as you move through chronological age, the correction matters less and less. Mm-hmm. But that is absolutely true.
Okay, so the question, going back to you're ready for school now, a lot of parents are watching us and they're very anxious because the school is about to start in a week or two, depends where we are. Do we disclose to the school, my child was born preterm, have a higher risk of having some difficulties in school? This is something that we parents really struggle with. A babies born late preterm, that we know there's still risks there, born late preterm. Do we disclose this information with the school? Because from my experience, some schools, at least my son's school, they don't have this knowledge of the preterm babies having difficulties and trying to intervene from the beginning of their school career, if I can say that, rather than wait until the problem actually show up and then you go in for an intervention.
Well, from what we know with research, the wait to fail model is one of the worst things we can do. So based on research, the earlier we know, the earlier teachers know, regardless of whether they have the knowledge on preterm birth and the risk factors. I think knowing that information could be helpful. And just the earlier we alert teachers, the earlier parents know themselves. I think just taking action early is always better than waiting to see if a problem will arise. And like Jan said, there's lots of screening tools available online for free as well. That can tell you whether there could be a risk for the future reading problem. So I think alerting anyone early is better than just waiting and not doing it.
Right. And the tools that you do have available, is that kind of tool that teachers can benefit from for all their students, or this is something that parents should be focusing on?
Yeah, these tools can definitely be used in the school context. But really the tools revolve around parents as experts of their own child. Now, that being said, you could do a developmental checklist and find that your child is at the end of kindergarten and hasn't, or you haven't seen them exhibit those key literacy behaviors or skills. And you could bring the report from a tool like that to that child's grade 1 teacher and say, look, we already know we need to pay some attention here. And that can be very useful information for a teacher who simply might not have the time or attention or capacity to observe your child's behavior. And of course, I'm sure people in the audience have heard the popular idea that dyslexia is more common among boys. Well, one of the explanations for that is that little girls tend to recede. Little boys are right out there. And so dyslexia tends to be picked up in boys because behavior problems are often mislabeled as reading problems or academic problems or school problems. Whereas a little girl can hide away until about grade 3 when you switch from learning to read to reading to learn, and all of a sudden the school curriculum depends on that child being able to read. And then all of a sudden the different rates of dyslexia between boys and girls start to even out because school depends on it. So that is to say, your child may be one of those polite children that the teacher can't observe because the teacher has to divide their attention across a whole bunch of kids. And so drawing that attention, because you've done a developmental checklist and alerting that teacher, it could be something very important, especially early in grade 1, where there's a really critical phase for the child to pick up those basic reading skills.
So yeah, you mentioned dyslexia, but all these reading issues that the children have, do they all have a diagnosis, or some are, I mean, not just, but not a diagnosed with a name, or some difficulty that the child has to catch up?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the term dyslexia gets thrown around. The individuals across the world who actually have a constitutional diagnosis of dyslexia is about 3 to 5% maximum. But the number of children, especially in English, who have reading difficulties is between 8 and 12%. So what's going on there? Reading difficulties are different from dyslexia. Some of them come from the English language. Some of those difficulties that are not dyslexia come from our education system. And when a grade 1 teacher has 28 kids, is anyone surprised that some of those kids fall between the cracks who don't have dyslexia? Mm-hmm. So, the formal diagnosis really, and this is from my experience as a child clinical psychologist, so much of school accommodations and the funding models that our schools have require a formal diagnosis. But the problem that neuropsychologists and child clinical and educational psychologists have is that we can't actually measure reading until grade 3. So we can't actually assess suitable for a diagnosis if a child has something like dyslexia or clinically significant reading difficulties until grade 3. As an interventionist, I know that's way too late to intervene. So parents are in a tough place, because to get those resources for the school to have the dedicated budget, you'll be waiting till the end of grade 2 at the best case, or into grade 3 for dyslexia or reading difficulty services for your child. This is part of how our system works.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
So for people who are not familiar with dyslexia, can you briefly let parents know what does it look like, what they should be aware of?
Yeah, so dyslexia, in the simplest or most universal kind of definition, is when a child shows persistent difficulties acquiring reading skill. And so what that means is that a child will not pick up reading skill in grade 1, and then in grade 2 will still not pick up reading skill, and then in grade 3 will still not pick up reading skill. In grade 1, maybe they won't be able to learn anything other than a small set of sight words. Those words that every child picks up. Kids with dyslexia can pick up a small number of those, but when you move into reading more complex words, reading nonsense words, reading infrequent words, then in grade 2, that will start to show up. And in grade 3, what will really start to show up is, first of all, reading avoidance, avoiding anything to do with reading. But then a child with dyslexia, if they must read or are asked to read, they will read slowly, they will read with difficulty, and they will read with a lot of errors and a lot of skipped words, miswords, or misread words. Those are really, that's the sequence. Now, Fabiana, of interest to you, in Italian, I can learn to read Italian in about 30 minutes. I won't understand a single thing I read, but I can read Italian with fluency because there is such a close relationship between letters and sounds. As a matter of fact, in Italian, you only have 3 exceptions and 1 twist. In English, there are about 36 exceptions and about 52 twists, if I can put it that way. Dr. Ben is smiling. I hope I got that right. So why do I bring this up? Because dyslexia looks very different in Italian. In Italian, you don't see difficulty reading words, but the difficulties show up in comprehension and the speed of reading. And so it can look different in different languages.
Wow, that is a very interesting, but I have to disappoint you, but I'm Brazilian and I speak Portuguese, not Italian.
Oh, I was using your last name. I'm so sorry.
I know I do have an Italian background, but I'm curious now to know how that looks like in Portuguese. No, but that is a very interesting point, because there's so many immigrants in Canada, right? We have so many languages. We have so many people like me who came here and have to teach kids English and read to them in English with our own accent and language and the speed of reading. So I was very curious to learn from you, teachers 2 languages at home, but also how that translates into the school in the late years. But we have one more question here from Josephine. Let me put here. Developmental follow-ups are usually done by the dermatologist. No, maybe something else. Do they have a child psychology knowledge? Developmental follow-up is usually a developmental pediatrician. Is that correct? Do they have a child psychology knowledge?
A developmental pediatrician definitely would have a child psychology knowledge. And what a developmental pediatrician would definitely have access to is checklists on a broad range of developmental dimensions. So motor, language, hopefully early literacy, but maybe not early literacy, or certainly early school achievement. They would have access to developmental milestones. So you would definitely want neonatologist.
She correct here, neonatologist. Yes, because a neonatal follow-up clinic will usually have a team of neonatologists and a multidisciplinary team. But I was wondering also, because our babies also do see development pediatricians in some cases. So neonatologists, let's go to that one.
Yeah, so either a developmental pediatrician or a neonatologist, they will have access to developmental milestones. The challenge there is that what often will happen is that they will assess broad domains, language, social, emotional, possibly learning or attention, and motor, of course, motor domains. And so when a domain is flagged, the challenge is to go into more detail. And that's going to really depend on the particular neonatologist involved. Hopefully that the neonatologist is sensitive. If you flag concern in the language domain, okay, we need to look more deeply here. And that's where you have to just make sure that the deeper look is being taken if a domain is flagged as concern. Okay,
so I have so many more questions, but we're going to wrap it up. But Prar, I would like to ask you, what is this offer for the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation families if they're interested in the program? I know you're offering free program until registration until August 31st. And if you're watching this recorded, is August 31st, 2023, in case you watch this next year. So what is the offer and how families can benefit from it?
Yeah, so at Sharpen, we have an early risk screener that can identify whether a child could be at risk for future reading problems. And we have an evidence-based early reading intervention program. So what we're offering for members of CPBF is a free risk screener. So if you email us at support@sharpen.com, we are offering a free risk screener and a 2-month free trial of the reading intervention program.
This is so great. Thank you so much for doing this for our families, because we know sometimes it's very hard to afford those services. And we are very grateful that you are offering this to our families. But I really want to thank you all so much today for this very enlightening session, just in time before school goes back in September. I think I learned so much, and I'm sure many of our families also learned so much from you, and what we need to watch in our little kids going to school in September. So thank you so much, all of you.
Very
Thanks
welcome.
for having us.
Thank you.
And to all of you watching us live today, thank you so much for joining the Preemie chats. And if you you can actually go to our website if you miss part of this session and any other Preemie chat. You go to the CanadianPreemies.org. Let me put the email, the website here. And I also want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support to our education sessions. And just a reminder that we are a charity organization, and we depend on people like you to continue to provide free services for our family. So please visit our website and consider making a donation. Together, we can all create a brighter future for all our families. And I see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay well.